And now it's time for another Dice Tower review with Mike Vincent.
Welcome back to part 2 of our look at Lord of the Rings, the living card game by Fantasy Flight Games. And again, we are looking at the tactics sphere for the core set. So last video, we finished talking about allies with 2 left to discuss today, those being Bjorn and the Veteran Axe Hand. So let's first look at Bjorn. He costs a whopping 6 resources, so he's a very costly ally to bring to the table, but you can see why when you look at his statistics and his special ability. He has 1 wisdom, not that you'll be using him for questing, and he has 3 attack, 3 defense, and a superior 6 hit points. Now, when you read his special ability, Action, Bjorn gains +5 attack until the end of the phase. At the end of the phase in which you trigger this effect, shuffle Bjorn back into your deck. Limit once per round. So we see Bjorn with some very strong assets, but with the drawback being a cost of 6. If you can somehow generate enough resources on a regular basis to justify bringing him out, he will certainly come in handy. Either as a defender with 3 defense and 6 hit points, he'll be able to take a lot of punishment and block from a lot of enemies. And if you do have a certain enemy with a lot of attacking power, he's potentially someone who could stand there and take a few hits over a matter of rounds and still be alive. However, if there's a big enemy you really need to take care of, if you're so overwhelmed that you need to clear enemies away, then you can use his special ability. So that will give him 8 attack, and unfortunately will send him back to the deck, but it's something that you could eventually get back and use again. Now, a workaround to make him more useful is taking a look at the card called Sneak Attack. So Sneak Attack is for the leadership sphere. So if you're playing a tactics leadership deck, this is a very cheap way to get Bjorn onto the table and use him to take care of any pesky enemies or to land some serious damage on a major enemy. So you'll only be able to use this card if you're using a multi-sphere deck, but this can be a very nice way to get Bjorn onto the table to do some damage, use his ability at a cost of 1 instead of 6. So Bjorn is a good ally, and in future packs there will be other tricks you can use to get Bjorn onto the table for much cheaper, but we'll talk about those in the future. So now turning our attention to the Veteran Axe Hand. He is a dwarf warrior. He has a cost of 2. He has 0 willpower, but does have 2 attack, 1 defense, and 2 hit points. So he's a solid ally. He's relatively inexpensive and will give you some attacking ability or some defending ability depending on what you need him for. Now, I mentioned before that the dwarf synergy is one of the first ones to be developed in this game, and so if you're playing a tactics deck, there aren't a ton of dwarf allies to choose from. So if you are looking at a dwarf deck, then the Veteran Axe Hand could certainly come in handy, especially if you have some synergies to help buff his attacking, his defense, or his hit points. Can make him a pretty valuable little ally for 2 cost. So now let's turn our attention to the events for the tactics sphere in the core set. And the first 3 event cards we're going to look at are all offensive in nature. So the first one is Quick Strike. It costs 1, and it says Action. Exhaust a character you control to immediately declare it as an attacker and resolve its attack against any eligible enemy target. So this is a very handy card, especially if you are up against some allies with some strong attack but weak defense. This allows you to get in a hit, as every time the enemies always get to attack you before you attack them. So by using Quick Strike, it allows you to hopefully attack and kill an enemy before it gets a chance to attack you and take up one of your characters for defense. So you're going to want to make sure you use this with a hero who probably would have enough damage and attack power to actually kill the enemy. But it is a useful card, and it can be a nice way to give your defenders some extra utility in a given turn so that they don't have to defend. The next event we'll look at is Rain of Arrows. It says, Action. Exhaust a character you control with the ranged keyword to choose a player. Deal 1 damage to each enemy engaged with that player. So personally, this is not a card that I've used a ton of. However, my wife, who often likes to play ranged decks, with all her heroes having the keyword ranged, has used this on occasion, particularly one character, if you're using a hammer and anvil strategy. Now, Hammer and Anvil strategy is where one character focuses on having a higher threat so that they can draw in enemies and do the blocking. And then once you use your heroes to defend, your partner, who is across the table from you, would use ranged heroes and ranged characters to attack with arrows and such to take out the enemies. So if you're using a Hammer Anvil strategy, then perhaps Rain of Arrows would be a useful card. We talked earlier about how Legolas and the Horseback Archer both have the keyword ranged, and so they would be able to use a rain of arrows to take care of any enemies who were either softened up already or who only had 1 hit point. Now, we did talk about using Thalon as well, so if you have Thalon doing 1 damage to everyone coming off the encounter deck, that will also soften them up, which you could potentially finish them off with Rain of Arrows. So certainly a card that has some utility. It's just not one that I've used personally very often, but my wife has used this, and it especially works well when you have a whole deck based around the keyword ranged. And finally, let's look at Swift Strike. It has a cost of 2. It says Response. After a character is declared a defender, deal 2 damage to the attacking enemy. Certainly this is a card with some utility as well. However, 2 cost for 1 action could be pricey depending on what type of deck you're running or what your strategy is going to be. So the nice thing is once a character is declared a defender, it will immediately do 2 damage, which will kill quite a few enemies, especially if you're using Thalon, who we already discussed, who's already dealt 1 damage to every enemy coming off the encounter deck. So that means any enemy with 3 hit points, if you're using Thalon, will fall very quickly to this 2 damage. You could also use this in conjunction with the Gondorian Spearman, who also does 1 damage when he's declared as a defender. So if you have 2 extra resources, you could play this on the Gondorian Spearman, and he would do 2 damage to the attacking enemy, in addition to his 1 damage from his special ability. So I mentioned earlier that perhaps you're running a deck that's focused solely on doing direct damage to enemies, and if it were, then Swift Strike would certainly be a card you might want to consider, especially if you have cards that will give you some extra resources, perhaps Horn of Gondor. So now I want to take a look at 3 event cards that are defensive in nature. So the first of which is called Stand Together, and is very handy, and then it has a cost of 0. So no resources need to be spent on this one. It reads, Action, choose a player. That player may declare any number of his eligible characters as defenders against each enemy attacking him this phase. So depending on what type of deck you're running and what encounter you are against, this can be a very handy card. If you have a few weaker allies whose defense isn't very high, it allows you to pool their defense together, and then you can block against all enemies that turn. So if you're in a combat heavy scenario where you're going to be fighting either a lot of enemies or 1 or 2 enemies with a lot of attack, then this is a nice cheap way to ensure your heroes stay alive. And again, if you're playing some sort of Hammer and Anvil strategy, it would allow you to do the blocking and let your partner, if they're using ranged attacks, to do the damage. So you can use all of your characters for defense, and your ally or your partner who you're playing with can do the damage and hopefully kill whatever enemy it is you're fighting. The second defensive event card we're going to take a look at is Thicket of Spears. It has a cost of 3 and reads, You must use resources from 3 different heroes' pools to pay for this card. Now this can be problematic in that you have to have 3 heroes who are all tactics. So this makes it very difficult if you're planning to use a multi-sphere deck, unless you have incorporated songs, which we'll be looking at in a future video, to give your heroes the proper resource icon that they need. However, if you do manage to muster the 3 resources, it says Action, choose a player. That player's engaged enemies do not attack this phase. So certainly a very useful ability, and again, one that could be a lifesaver given the scenario. If you are against a plethora of enemies, or if you are against one very deadly enemy, this allows you to prevent that attack from happening. Now, it is expensive in that it costs 3, and is certainly somewhat restrictive given that each hero must pay for one of the resources, but if you've built a deck around this card, and there are heroes coming out in future expansions who combo very well with Thicket of Spears, but more on that later. However, this is a very good card for defense given the right deck. And finally, we're going to take a look at Feint. This is a card I always include in my decks if I'm playing a tactics deck, and it has 1 cost and reads combat action. Choose an enemy engaged with a player. That enemy cannot attack this phase. So just a very straightforward, easy to play defensive card that will allow you to prevent 1 attack. Now, there's lots of enemies in this game with a pretty nasty attack score, and so it's nice to have one of these in hand, knowing that you can stop that attack from happening. The nice thing too is if you are with a partner, you can also use this to prevent an attack against them as well. So this is a very versatile card in that it only costs 1. You can use it on you or your partner, and basically any enemy who looks threatening or could do some damage this turn will be stopped by using Feint. So Feint is a card I very much like to include in my tactics decks. So the last card we're going to be taking a look at today is Blade Mastery. Blade Mastery is an event. It has a cost of 1 and reads Action. Choose a character. Until the end of the phase, that character gains +1 attack and +1 defense. So this card is okay. It's nice that it only costs 1, and it's somewhat versatile, and then it can be used for attack or defense. However, my problem with this card is that it only lasts until the end of the phase. For me, if I were to choose cards to include in my deck, or to choose resources that I would have to spend, I think I'd much rather spend them on an attachment, like a weapon or armor, something that will permanently buff their attack and defense, because this card is only lasts for the phase. Now, yes, it could get you out of a tight corner if you really need to get some last-minute attacking or last-minute defense. Perhaps that 1 extra attack will kill an enemy who you have to get rid of, or the 1 defense will save your hero from dying. Then I can see this card having some utility. However, in general, this is not a card I play very often, and usually don't include in my decks, as I find there are better cards for buffing attack and defense, and often I'll use an attachment instead. So Blade Mastery, it's okay. It costs 1 resource, which is nice, but it's not a card that I use very often. So that brings us to the final card and the end of our look at the Tactics Sphere for the core set. I would like to let you know that I tend to play this game cooperatively with 2 players and often don't play this game solo. So you may notice that by watching my videos that it has a somewhat slight bias towards playing the game cooperatively and less so for a solo game. Now, Tactics I find to be a good sphere in the core set if you're playing with a partner who can quest. However, I can see this having some limitations in a solo deck. Because Tactics is so focused around attacking and defending, I can see it being very problematic to get your questing in, even if you're using Legolas in a solo game. However, I do find that if you're using Tactics with another sphere, perhaps you're using Tactics and Leadership, it can be a very nice complementary deck to both buff the allies and to use attacking and defending, while your partner who you're playing with can take most of the questing, especially if they're playing a spirit deck. It could work perhaps to combine tactics and spirits so that you had some combat ability and some questing ability if you're playing solo, but I would say that tactics is best used with a partner, often if the partner is playing a spirit deck. So your partner might be the one doing all of the questing, and you will mostly be responsible for killing all the enemies, which, to be honest, is one of the best parts of this game. Not that questing isn't fun, but there's certainly something to be said for being the one who's going in, taking on the enemies, and hacking them down. So, thank you very much for watching. Next week, we're going to take a look at the Leadership Sphere.
Thanks so much for watching the Dice Tower videos. Find more great videos and reviews, as well as our top-rated audio podcast at Dicetower.com. You can also find other great shows at Dicetowernetwork.com. I'm Eric Summerer, and you've been watching The Dice Tower. The Dice Tower is sponsored by Cool Stuff Inc., where you can find great games for great prices. Cool stuff in stock. Check them out at CoolStuffInc.com.